This is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today's topic surrounds one of the most significant transformations in our society over the last 200 years, which is what our scholars today call the creeping or perhaps precipitous militarization of American democracy and American culture. The founders of our society expected us to be a society with very small military presence, and we've become a society with a very large military presence, and war has become the metaphor we use for everything from conflicts overseas to health crises at home. Our two experts today are two of the leading people writing about this transformation, what it means for our society today, and how we need to escape the militarized thinking that seems to dominate so much of our society. We're very fortunate to have with us two professors, Professor Neta Crawford, who's a professor and chair of political science at Boston University. She's the author of numerous books, including Accountability for Killing, Moral Responsibility for Collateral Damage in America's Post-9/11 Wars, and Argument and Change in World Politics, which is actually a book I've assigned to students for years. In addition, we have Catherine Lutz. She's the Thomas J. Watson Family Junior Professor. She's the Thomas J. Watson Junior Family Professor of Anthropology and International Studies at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. And she's the author as well of numerous books, including War and Health, The Medical Consequences of the Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, The Bases of Empire, and the Bases of Empire, it has a dual meaning, and Homefront, A Military City and the American 20th Century. Among other things, Neta and Kathy are co-directors of the Costs of War project at Brown University, which I think is one of the best projects in tracing the costs of America's recent wars. I often use that data myself in my research and teaching. And they published this week a wonderful and informative piece in The Hill called Fighting a Virus with the Wrong Tool. We've linked that piece to this podcast. Neta and Kathy, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
So before we go to our discussion with Neta and Kathy, we of course have our scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Siri. Zachary, what's the title of your poem?
Carpet bombing disease.
Well, let's hear about carpet bombing disease.
Carpet bombing disease. Could Washington have imagined our military, our 1.3 million tank-armed nuclear arsenal force, burning down jungles, assassinating foreign leaders till we're hoarse, and parading their guns on TV advertisements that make war look like a video game? Could Ben Franklin comprehend our armies, the biggest piece of the American apple pie, with apple slices to make civilization die, and cinnamon crust to put a million 6 feet under? We are waiting for Armageddon with our tanks and heat-seeking missiles, hoping to prove our greatness by forcing it upon other peoples, thinking the American dream must be hidden in age-weathered hills or war-ravaged steeples, or trying to find our best lame excuses for torture. But Lincoln could have told us that safety does not come from waiting for the burglar with a gun pointed at the door, that militarism division is a smoke-snorting boar waiting in the wings of democracy. And where do we find ourselves dying but at the obvious hands of disease, like the biblical pestilences or bombastic plagues? Where is the threat but in our own hands, multiplying in our face like some spoof on the jets blasting over football stands? Some prank, the germs that crawled into the budget-barren outcrops of public health. How will we find ourselves after trying to carpet bomb disease, but standing in the glorious desolation of the survivors and fleas, a few thousand chanting the words to the Pledge of Allegiance, praying war will save us from nature's grievance?
That's a very powerful poem, Zachary, particularly the ending. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the American obsession with our military and with power abroad. But in many ways, too, it's about how militarism has crept into every facet of our lives. And we see it very strongly in this public health crisis that we're now in the middle of.
Well, I think that's a perfect spot to turn to Neta and Kathy. Neta, what do we mean when we talk about militarism? What does that concept mean in practice?
Well, it's essentially making the military seem like or be the tool you turn to first, and you believe that it's effective, efficient, that it's going to solve your problems over other tools. And the militarism really is essentially the idea that the use of force is effective because that's what people respond to.
I see. Kathy, you're an anthropologist, among other things. How does what Neta explained so clearly, how does that influence our culture as a society?
Well, it is based in a set of beliefs. Nita's identified a couple of them. The idea that force is efficient. Let's say, you could maybe get something done, but if you're in a hurry, better to use force because it will get your goal, reach you your goal much more efficiently. So there's a whole set of cultural beliefs that people sort of absorb growing up in this society in different ways, in different sort of subcultural areas of the country. But it's a very, very widespread assumption on the left and the right that war is tragic, but often necessary. So there's really a very long list, a long sort of set of ideas that help to support the institution itself. So the cultural supports there, we think of them as kind of pillars of belief that hold up the whole political economic system of war spending, war preparation, and war waging.
And how do we? Why is militarism so dangerous for a society like ours?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that when you say that the use of force is going to be, in every case, legitimate or effective or efficient, what you're saying is that you're not going to let the force of the better argument, that is a democratic approach, guide you, or that you're going to put your resources into what's seen to be the most effective tool. So it's both an opportunity cost for a democracy, and it's also basically undermining the basic idea of democracy and human rights, which is that people together will decide what it is good and right to do. The cost of having this sort of belief system is, as Nita was saying, it's an opportunity cost for democracy, the better argument, the sort of collective discussion, and the national security state that's developed in tandem with this is one that just requires secrecy, requires that we not have the discussion. Leave this to the experts, and the use of force is what we're always told. Even though there's nothing more important in terms of democratic deliberation than the decision to go to war. So it's quite ironic that we've gotten to that. But there's also opportunity costs that our project, the Costs of War Project, has identified. Some of them through the work of Dr. Heidi Peltier, who's talked about the way in which investing in military equipment and the military as an institution creates far fewer jobs than other kinds of investments, including investments in healthcare, partly because they are obviously much more labor-intensive kinds of sectors, but also because it saves lives rather than loses them to a society. So that's a huge opportunity cost that we've invested in war rather than green energy or public health.
Well, Kathy, one of the things that has struck me about the Costs of War project is that you and Neta and your other collaborators document the costs of our wars, the actual cost, and it's mind blowing in some ways. What do you say to those who would argue that the money we spend on the military has all kinds of positive effects through innovation, developing the internet, Tang, all sorts of things of that kind.
I love that image. Yeah,
Tang,
I love the image.
But I think Tang we can chalk up to the space program. But never mind. I digress.
because the image of drinking Tang while surfing the web is just such a boon to civilization.
Yes.
Anyway, I do think some of that assumption about the efficiency is just wrong, just as it is in the case of force itself, whether that can create a new social order in a way that more effectively and efficiently than something else. The same thing's true here. We have such sharp examples with this virus and the call on the military to provide things that people now are acting that like we ought to be extremely grateful that this ship has sailed up the Hudson to deliver 1,000 beds to the people of New York. The cost of that ship, the inefficiency and expense of delivering that healthcare that way, rather than having built a hospital years ago that would have served underserved neighborhoods in New York all this time with 1,000 beds and be available today. I mean, that's the kind of thing that is true on so many grounds, that more direct investment straight into the civilian world of need would get you much more bang for your buck, to use the wrong metaphor again.
You see, even you're caught in this culture of militarism, Kathy.
Yes.
Neta?
Well, if you want a hospital or you want a road, better to build that thing directly than have the military give it to you as a side benefit. So all of the innovation that we could think of as coming from a military industrial complex could have been actually provided for much more directly, efficiently, effectively, perhaps, than through investing in a military industrial complex and getting those things as a side benefit or a side payment. So I completely agree with Kathy there. It's not just that we could get these things, ablative surfaces for warheads that are, returning to Earth. Okay, we could have got something that could resist heat much more effectively by not putting it on a nuclear warhead, but investing. But we've distorted our economy and our belief system so much that is sometimes the only way we can get resources directed to something. That's the deep, to my mind, sort of fundamental distortion of this, 150, 200 years of militarism that sometimes we can only get something if it's a side benefit of the war system. So think about investing in women and children of veterans or of people who've been killed in wars. That kind of social welfare system has been a consequence in some cases of war. But couldn't we have done that without war? Unlikely in a society that says that, our highest priority is the control of everything, everywhere, all the time, out there and at home. But if we had a more compassionate society that had different beliefs, we might have gotten it.
Right. No, this is a great point. It invokes the work of Neta Scotspool and others, as well as two of you. I'm curious, as a historian, is this something that's been baked into our system forever? Because many of our first social welfare programs, going back to the 19th century, are themselves built around the military. If one thinks about Civil War pensions, which were the largest federal outlay in the second half of the 19th century. Is this something baked into our system, or how has it become more of a problem? How has it become more significant over time?
Well, it's definitely, if you look at federal spending on the military, that is definitely a post-World War II phenomenon that we expect to have this sort of, as you said,
eyes and hands on everything around the globe at all times. Before World War II, and after each of the previous wars, the military demobilized in a really substantial way. And it's only in the post-World War II period that we have this giant standing army. So that's definitely not a timeless feature of the American government or our society.
Sure, and you referred to this earlier, Kathy, I think quite appropriately, as the national security state. The phrase national security itself was very infrequently used, if at all, before World War II, and it seems ubiquitous now, right?
Right. And that's where, I think people are starting to notice, and I think this hopefully will be something that sort of cracks open the discussion a little bit, this virus, because people are asking, I don't feel very secure. Here is the richest country on earth. We should be able to have purchased a public health system that keeps us safe. And so that idea that of going overseas and looking for threats there is going to have perhaps hopefully less allure than it might have absent the virus.
Could I intervene with a couple of other thoughts though about this? Kathy, you and I have often talked about, whether or not and how deep is American militarism. And I tend to think of it as, being foundational in the sense that from the beginning, the United States is built on war and dispossession of land of other people. And that is from the colonial period through the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, all the Indian Wars, the U.S.-Mexico War, the Civil War, where Indian Wars continued throughout, the continuation of the Indian Wars, and then moving into the Philippines with the Spanish-American War, that militarism is a constant. But what you rightly identify is the way that, in the past, when military spending reached maybe 60% of total government expenditures, national government expenditures in, let's say, the War of 1812 or the Civil War, it went down afterwards. And we didn't have a permanent military establishment. There was a decline in the number of people in the standing army. But what we see post-World War II is the continuation of that. So the only wrinkle I'm adding here is to say that there is part of the United States history, its DNA, if you will, which is completely dependent upon and imbued with the sense that might makes right. We can take what we want when we want by the use of force, and it works. And it's deployed intermittently in the 18th and 19th century, but much more frequently in the 20th century, and has become permanent in the 20th century and 21st century. This sort of permanent mobilization.
I think that's very well said. One of the points I often make to students is that scale matters, right? So this might be something that was germinating in the history of our society for 200 to 300 years in different formats, but it does seem to have multiplied in its scale, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. I think that's what the two of you are saying. Why do you think that's happened? What's been the cause of this? Is this a conspiracy, or what has multiplied the effects of militarism in our society for the last 6-7 decades?
So many things. I think the one of the largest components of this is the development of these large corporations for whom these large government contracts with the Department of Defense and Department of Energy for nuclear weapons and so on are basically their lifeblood. And the decline in the quality of our democracy as companies of that ilk and others have increasing power over our representatives through the lack of campaign finance controls. We have, again, a incredible incentive structure for continued massive investment in not just the weaponry and the all of the contracts more generally, but in the idea that supports this high level of spending, which is that the world is a world of threat, that force works and that this is who we are and have to be.
So yours is a political economic argument in part.
Yeah.
And I would only add to that what you got to at the end there, Kathy, which is I think that the mobilization of fear is essential here. That not just a reaction to what is out there, but the idea that the world's a threatening place. The best way to respond to those threats, according to this logic of militarism, is with force and the readiness to use it. But I also think that the mobilization of fear is political. So think back to the 1980s or the late 1970s, when the Committee on the Present Danger told us that the Soviet Union was building bigger weapons, more warheads. They were going to come across East Germany into West Germany, and we needed to have more military force to respond to this imminent threat. So with the end of the Cold War, that declines, but then other threats had to be essentially found in the post-Cold War era. And the threat in that period became what the DoD called uncertainty. So we were prepared to respond to a world where we wouldn't know where the threats would be coming, but we had to be prepared for everything. And then in the post-9/11 world, we've got reasonable fear, but no sense of what risks we're willing to live with, right? So in fact, the fear becomes unreasonable, and we need to be prepared to, again, meet uncertainty and everything everywhere all the time. And I think that the psychological piece here is really important, and the fact that we sort of can't calm our nervous systems down enough to have a good understanding of, well, what risks are we willing to live with? If we can't have 100% certainty that nothing bad will happen to us, what can we endure? And then the other part of that is this, it's not just the domestic military-industrial complex and their influence on legislatures, which I think can't be overstated in some respects, but it's this sort of desire to maintain American hegemony and to not lose face and influence in the world. It seems to me as if, in America, which is in decline in part because we spend so much money on military forces and protecting everything everywhere all the time, is anxious to hold on to that hegemony, its great power status, when history tells us that you can't hang on to that great power status by spending, overreaching, creating enemies. In fact, what we're doing is counterproductive to maintaining that great power status. It's this kind of American imaginary of the great power, greater than Rome, and we must maintain this position or there's something sort of wrong with us. And that is totally linked with the American standard of living and our sense of, things should be cheap and easy, and we should be able to, completely control and grow our economy, and that nothing bad should happen to us in terms of both economics and politics. We have to be, I don't know. I just think, like a Leviathan, and if we can't do that, there's something wrong. So that's in part why we keep spending high levels of our treasury on war when in fact it's counterproductive.
And Neta, this is really powerful what you said, and it connects directly into the piece that you and Kathy published this week in The Hill, which in some ways motivated this conversation, and I hope everyone will read the piece. You and Kathy argue that, just as following the lines of what you just articulated, that our hyper-militarization has now become self-defeating, and that in this pandemic, using war as a metaphor is actually hurting us. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, actually, I'll say something about that, but I also want to give an example of what Neta's talking about that connects these as well. And let me start with the example. There's this aircraft carrier that where carrying 5,000 sailors, which everyone has heard about in the last couple of days who's been watching the news.
Yes.
And the rear admiral at the command of the ship has been relieved of his duty for having had the temerity to announce more publicly than he should have that his sailors are sick. And again, this is the 11th aircraft carrier group out and around the planet doing the work that Neta suggests it's doing, but they're being felled by a virus just like anyone else. The idea that he was not supposed to be announcing a weakness in a country that could have done without 8 or 9 of those aircraft carrier groups and still been the dominant sea force on the planet is a sign of that sort of, again, irrationality, the idea that there's no limit to the invulnerability and the power that the United States has to wield. In the meantime, they're landing on the island of Guam and putting their sailors, again, with the sort of arrogance that, and the racialized arrogance that Neta's pointing to in our longer history, on the island in the civilian neighborhoods, in a hotel where, when they already have a third of the island's landmass under their control, where they could have put the 6 sailors. So this is just an example of how, when you look at the way in which these two things, the virus and this giant military, intersect, the irrationality, the militarism, and the problems that come with it are very visible. But what's happening instead is that people are turning to the military, both in government and in the general public, and assuming that this is who is going to save us. They're going to send us their ships. They're going to send us their ventilators. They're going to build us hospitals. They're going to send us their personnel. And they're doing some of those things, but they're not doing it in the same way that the civilian sector might do it, and they're not doing it at the same with the same cost as the civilian sector would have done it. And again, some of these resources should have been in civilian hands to start with, so that the public health problems that America has had for years, high rates of infant mortality, maternal mortality in the African American community, high rates of diabetes and cancers and all sorts of diseases of our environment and our food supply. I mean, these are the kinds of things that, might have been problems that might have been tackled with those funds, which instead were fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to the kind of ends that we've seen. So I don't know if that's answers the question that you had.
Yes. That's a very powerful point, and an example that's not only poignant but deeply troubling. Deeply troubling. Neta, did you want to add to that?
No, that nails it.
So then what should we be responding to when people, and it's not just those on one side of the political spectrum, when we hear all kinds of individuals saying that we're at war with the pandemic? Is that the wrong thing to say?
I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong to equate any kind of struggle, any mobilization with war. And the kind of mobilization that we could be engaged in, one where compassion and care and the use of resources to help, it shouldn't be difficult to find a metaphor of love and connection, but instead we have to mobilize a metaphor of defeat and basically destruction. It's true that this is a struggle, but not all struggles need to be equated with war. I find that disturbing in a sense. Again, it's valorizing war when we know that, when war is valorized, that means that it becomes seen as both possible and legitimate. And there are other things that we are doing which are not warlike. We're actually helping people by helping them, providing, for instance, ways for people to make masks at home and contribute those masks to hospitals. That's a gesture of generosity and care. It's not war.
Right. Actually, the metaphor directs our attention to the virus. Right. It says we want to kill the virus. The virus is the enemy. Right. And President Trump in particular has riffed on this quite a bit. The idea that it's an invisible enemy. And we're destroying it. And that, I mean, one can't sort of say that that's not what we're trying to do. We are trying to destroy the ability of the virus to replicate and move from person to person. But because we focus on that as opposed to mutual care, it's and the metaphors that we would be using there that might be more available in a different kind of society would allow us to focus more on that. Again, those stories aren't absent from the media or from the way we talk to each other, but certainly the much more common metaphor is one that doesn't focus on that.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. War implies violence and it implies winners and losers. And the love metaphor that you both invoked, or something similar to that, would imply mutuality in a way that's probably more appropriate. Zachary, you want to ask about where we go from here. Really, we always like to close on a positive note. What can we learn? How can we do better? Zachary, go ahead.
How do you think we begin to counter this trend of militarism, which has really captured our country over the past 2 decades? How do we begin to counteract that?
I think we do have the opportunity right now to object to the use of the military or the celebration of the military as the savior here. I mean, I think that's almost. I'm not maybe answering the question of how do we go backwards from where we are now to or go forward to a better social order, but I do think that in this current crisis and moment, the opportunity is there to at least push back on a further valorization of the military as the be all and end all institution of American society. And certainly public polls show that over the last many decades, the U.S. military has gotten more and more public support for a variety of reasons, more and more of a sense that soldiers are super citizens and that the institution is the most, has the highest character of it's they, not the nurses and doctors who've been allowed to get off the planes first or, get salutes at sporting events. But one can imagine that if we push this forward, we're thanking healthcare workers and the cleaners and the food service workers in the hospitals, thanking them for their service and community care, rather than an institution whose main purpose will always be to wage war.
I also wanted to respond to that if I could.
Please.
I think, Zachary, one of the important things that we can do is think about if we had a world that we'd all like to see, one where our basic needs are met, one where people could get the kinds of education that they needed to pursue their aspirations, one where you were doing work that you felt was valued and valuable. That when we think about that kind of world, we don't get it by building a military. We might be able to protect it if we were attacked, but we're not being attacked for the most part. We get the world that we want to see by investing in life-affirming institutions and practices and learning how to deal with conflict in ways that are not militarized, but rather that are respectful and deeply democratic. So I think to get there, what we have to do is decrease military spending in the U.S., which is much greater than any of its rivals, and put those resources where they could do better work for us, not just at home, but in the rest of the world. So I think it's really rethinking about how we conceive of security, what security means. It's called human security in the literature, but really it's an ethic of care and responsibility and democracy that we need to be promoting, rather than putting all of our eggs into a basket that says the best thing that we can do is deploy resources that were meant to kill, and we're going to deploy those ill-fitting resources for war. I think we have to just start prioritizing these other values rather than the military one.
Well, and I think, Neta and Kathy, that's a perfect point to close on. What you have elucidated in your scholarship, both of you, through the Costs of War project at Brown, that I hope everyone will look at, through your recent article in The Hill, and in your insights today, you've elucidated the ways in which we, as a very rich, well-endowed society, have perhaps misused many of our resources. And we see this so clearly today when, as you said, we're confronted with this huge health crisis, and we seem so under-resourced in some of the basic human care that we would expect as citizens in any society, but particularly in a society with the resources that we have. And if nothing else, this moment, as you have pointed out so well, and you anticipated in your scholarship, this moment should force us to rethink how we allocate our resources and the priorities we set at home as well as abroad. I want to thank you for joining us today, for lending your insights. I want to encourage our listeners to read your scholarship. And of course, I want to thank Zachary for his poem as well. Thank you for joining us for this episode of This is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.